Hi, my name is Gabriel Evans, and I am a picture book author and illustrator. I've written and illustrated over 6 picture books, and I've illustrated a further 20 plus books for other authors. I started out my career as an illustrator when I was a kid. I was that kid that loved drawing. I drew on my school books, I drew on scraps of paper, I drew on backs of envelopes, and I even drew on shopping lists. When I turned 12, I was given a visual diary, and this meant that I could keep all my illustrations and drawings together. It also meant I started properly experimenting with watercolour paints. Now, up until that point, no one had shown me how to paint in watercolour, so I had to teach myself. And I spent years practicing watercolour paints in my visual diaries. And the more I practiced, the better I got with creating watercolor illustrations, to the point where one day I decided to send my artwork to a whole lot of publishers around Australia. Now, from all those publishers I sent my art to, I only heard back from one. They were a very small picture book, they were a very small publisher, and they said to me, Gabriel, we would love you to illustrate a book for us. You have 3 months. And I realized I had no idea how to be a picture book illustrator. And in that 3 months, I had to teach myself and have this book finished. And I was only 17 at the time. After that book, I illustrated a few more books and I got better at illustrating. I got better to the point that a larger publisher came along called Walker Books, who asked me to illustrate for them. Since I've worked with Walker Books, I've worked with a whole list of other fantastic Australian publishers. And today I want to focus on one of those books that I have illustrated. And this book is A Perfectly Posh Pink Afternoon Tea by Vass. When it comes to inspiration, I think it's important to look for inspiration wherever you go. So I love to look at other illustrators and I get inspired by a whole number of things that they offer. Whether it's the design of their page, whether it's the way they construct their illustrations to kind of really engage the reader, whether it's their use of color, whether it's the way they make their characters, I am inspired. And just because I'm inspired by something doesn't mean I'm going to work exactly like that person. I would like to give you some examples of some people that have inspired me. So the first is a very big name. His name is John Carson. He is a world-renowned illustrator and author, and his first book that he wrote and illustrated was I Want My Hat Back. And this is a great way of taking a very traditional way of making a picture book and turning it on its head a little bit, making a little bit of fun out of it. This also is a very well designed book, and it is very, very deceptively simple in the way it's been created. Another book I like is Sam and Dave Dig a Hole by Mac Barnett and John Carson. Another one with John Carson. This book is a great pantomime feeling book that is all about look behind you, and the viewer gets frustrated that the characters in this book aren't seeing what we're seeing. And for me, I'm very much inspired by how much these two guys push this concept in this book. Moving on to another illustrator, Isabel Arsenault. Isabel does beautiful pencil work, and she has really inspired me with how she uses just one color, a monochromatic color, but in varied tones to create beautiful textures and atmosphere in her work. And it's not just books that I look for inspiration in. I also collect artwork, and this artwork doesn't have to be even picture book related, but I can still find some inspiration. So this is an example of, and I hope there's no reflection there, of an artist that has inspired me. This is a lithograph from Berlin. It was made just before World War II by an artist I'm unsure of. And the style of the work, the use of the line work in this picture, I find very inspirational and has helped me with some of my pictures. Finally, I want to talk about inspiration from outside pictures and picture books. And this is an example. The honest toilet roll. You can find inspiration from everything around you. You can even find inspiration from a toilet roll. For example, what happens if there was a toilet roll that lived in a toilet and didn't want to be used as a toilet roll? That is all I need to help me get inspired to come up with a picture book, story, or illustration. Looking at things around me to get inspiration, I think, is one of the best ways to inspire yourself. A perfectly posh pink afternoon tea party is all about being posh and having tea. To a point, because there is a twist. The story takes place when 6 young friends all decide to get dressed up in oversized dresses and hats and beads to have a tea party. Now, these 6 girls are all being incredibly posh and elegant about this party, but what they don't know is that there are 2 boys over the fence planning to ruin the tea party. And the way they plan to ruin it is by turning the sprinklers on and drenching the girls in water. However, when they do this, the outcome is probably not what the boys were expecting, because the girls, instead of crying or running away, they adapt and they start having a mud party where they're just rolling around, jumping in the mud, having a great old time. And the final scene in this book is 1, the girls are there, all very muddy, and 2, the boys are now having a posh tea party. And I think this book has an important message. It is all about not stereotyping. Just because these girls liked to dress up in posh clothes doesn't mean they're not going to enjoy jumping around and getting dirty in the mud. And just because the boys are being a bit cheeky and turning the sprinklers on and teasing doesn't mean that they're not going to enjoy having a very posh tea party themselves. The way I approach my illustrations for each book really depends on the type of book it is. So some books demand that the illustrations should be bold and bright, while others require a little bit more of a subtle approach. Now, I've got some illustrations of mine to the side of me to show you some examples of how I might approach an illustration. So the first one is this cats in jumpers illustration. Now, if you look here, you can see that I have created this illustration using pen line washed over with bright concentrated watercolour. And concentrated means there's not a lot of water, there's a lot of the pigment of the watercolour, so it's very, very bright. In this next illustration, this is an illustration from Norton and the Bear. And you can see that the illustration is a lot more of a subtle illustration. And that's because the illustration has been created using pencil lines, which are a lot softer than pen, washed over with gentle glazes of watercolour. So the result is a softer illustration. Next we have this little fun illustration. And this is a combination of using a lot of paint and also soft pencil line. So if you look at the little boy, he's created using gentle pencil lines washed over with colour. And then in contrast, we have the dog, who is painted using very heavy, thick paint. And that paint is basically drawing the outline of the dog. Finally, I have this big illustration. And this is an illustration from Blue Flower. Now, unlike the other ones, there's not much line work. The line work, which is created in pencil, is pretty much just limited to the little girl and the cat here and some of the buildings down here. The rest of the illustration is created using watercolour. And you can see I've used big, bold brush strokes throughout the sky and then smaller, softer brush strokes to create the grass and the textures. The illustrations for Perfectly Posh Pink Afternoon Tea, they were created using pen for the outlines and then bright, bold washes of colour to really make it a very bright book. And I also used gouache. And gouache is a little bit like watercolour, but it's a thicker pigment of watercolour, which means that I can make really painterly strokes in the artwork. So if you look at the skies in Perfectly Posh, you'll notice that you can see the individual brush strokes, and you can see it's quite thick and opaque. And then you can look at the dresses of the girls, and you'll see that there are washes of watercolour with highlights in gouache. So that might be the polka dots or other little patterns within the dresses. So I would love if you go and have a look at some of the illustrations in A Perfectly Posh, but see if it still looks like my work when you compare it to maybe one of my other books.